Who truly weaves your destiny? The gods or something older? Find a quiet place and discover the secret of the Great Loom. Part 1. The Genesis. Chapter 1. The Forge of a Billion Stars. Who truly weaves your destiny? The gods or something older? Find a quiet place and discover the secret of the Great Loom. Before time had a name, before darkness was defined by the absence of light, there was neither. There was only the potential, an infinite, chaotic ocean of what could be, shimmering with unborn energies and silent, impossible thoughts. It was a storm with no beginning and no end. And into this storm came the makers. They were not gods, for gods can be named and understood. They were principles given form, ideas that had achieved a will. There was the maker whose heart was a singularity, whose skin was the pull of gravity itself. There was the maker whose breath was the first light, and whose shadow was the concept of the void. Another moved in silence, its touch giving meaning to cold and stillness. They were few, and their names, if they ever had them, are lost to the echoes of what came after. They did not speak, but they understood one another. They saw the chaos of the potential, not as a threat, but as an imperfection, an unwritten page, an untuned instrument. And so, in the heart of this endless storm, they built their workshop. They called it the Forge. The forge of a billion stars was not a place of metal and fire, but of concept and will. The maker of gravity laid the anvil, a point of impossible mass that bent the chaos around it, giving it a center. The maker of light brought the flame, a star, the first star, born of pure will, whose heat could temper the raw energies of the potential. And then the work began. The first hammerfall was not a sound, it was a law. Gravity struck the anvil, and a wave of order spread through the chaos. Unruly energies which had darted and screamed for eons were suddenly bound by a simple, elegant rule. They began to spin, to gather, to coalesce. With each strike of that silent hammer, a million swirling dust clouds were born, the seeds of future galaxies. The maker of light would then breathe upon these clouds. Its breath, a solar wind of pure creation, ignited their cores. One by one, stars flickered into existence. White giants, blue dwarfs, stable yellow suns. They were the sparks from the anvil, each one a note in a symphony that was slowly taking shape. The forge was now a light, a lonely island of purpose in an infinite sea of what if. They worked for an age that has no number. They forged the great slow-moving rivers of dark matter that would guide the galaxies. The maker of silence would pass through the new creations, its touch crystallizing hot gas into planets of ice and stone, giving them the gift of stillness and form. Other makers whose domains are even less understood wove the intricate laws of existence. They whispered the rules of chemistry into being. They designed the elegant dance of mathematics. They painted the spectrum of color onto the canvas of light. They were artists, methodical, patient, and utterly consumed by their work. And in all this vast cosmic creation, they decided to craft one masterpiece, a world that would not just be a testament to their power, but to their art. a world that would hold a perfect balance of all their principles. They chose a young, yellow star in a quiet arm of a newly born galaxy. They gathered the finest cosmic dust, enriched with metals forged in the hearts of the first supernovas. The maker of gravity shaped the planet with unparalleled care, giving it a gentle tilt for seasons, a stable moon to calm its tides. The maker of light positioned it perfectly so that its dawns would be soft and its twilights long and beautiful. The maker of silence gifted it with deep, quiet caves and the vast, still expanse of the night sky. They called this world Athol, and when they looked upon it, they saw that it was good. The oceans swirled with potential life, the mountains stood in silent majesty, and the clouds painted fleeting masterpieces across the sky. Their great work, the symphony of existence, was complete. The fires in the forge of a billion stars began to cool. The silent hammer was laid to rest. The makers, their forms weary from the strain of pure creation, looked out upon the cosmos they had built. It was vast, vibrant, and filled with the light of their will. But their work was done. The untuned instrument was now playing a perfect, silent song. And in that silence, a new feeling entered the makers. A feeling of completion. A feeling of distance. They had built the stage, but the play had not were tired. So very tired. Chapter 2. The Great Loom and the First Thread. Before the makers departed, they gathered one last time at the heart of their creation, in the silent space where the forge once burned. They knew their work, as perfect as it was static. It was a beautiful, frozen moment in time. For life to truly flourish, for stories to be written, there needed to be a mechanism for change, a way for the future to unfold from the present. They needed to introduce the concept of fate. And so they built their final and perhaps greatest creation, the Great Loom. It was not forged from starlight or gravity, but from the very laws they had written. Its frame was made of the unbending logic of mathematics. Its gears were the patient, turning cycles of time. Its shuttle, the instrument that would carry the threads, was the principle of cause and effect. The loom was colossal, yet it occupied no space. It existed as an overlay on reality itself, its invisible structure touching every star, every planet, every mote of dust in the cosmos. It was a machine designed to weave the story of everything. But a loom is useless without thread. The makers looked upon their own essences, the pure, powerful concepts that defined them. They knew that to give the universe a future, they had to give a part of themselves. The maker of gravity offered a sliver of its being. It became the thread of destiny, a heavy silver cord that would dictate the great, unchangeable events, the birth of a sun, the death of a galaxy, the slow, inevitable march of entropy. It was the backbone of the great tapestry. The maker of light gave a filament of its first breath. It became the thread of hope, a thin golden strand that would weave moments of courage, of creation, of unexpected beauty into the fabric of existence. It was the glint of light in the darkness. The maker of silence contributed an essence of its stillness. This became the thread of peace, a cool blue fiber that would create moments of calm, of understanding, of quiet reflection. One by one, the others followed, each weaving a part of their nature into the spools of the great loom. There was the crimson thread of passion, the green thread of growth, the gray thread of sorrow. Together, they created a palette of infinite possibility. The machine was complete. The threads were in place. The makers set the great gears of time in motion, and the loom began to work. With a hum that resonated not in the ears, but in the soul, the shuttle of cause and effect began its first pass. It picked up a single silver thread of destiny. The loom wove this thread through the world of Aethel, their masterpiece. The thread touched the lifeless oceans, and deep within the hydrothermal vents, a complex chain of chemistry began. The first simple life sparked into being. The thread passed over the barren continents, and a great mountain range buckled and rose, changing the world's weather patterns forever. The shuttle moved with an unthinking, perfect logic, its path dictated by the laws the makers had written. The great tapestry of fate had begun. Satisfied, their final task complete, the makers prepared to leave. Their purpose was fulfilled. The universe no longer needed its architects. It now had the loom to guide its story. They began to fade, their cosmic forms dissolving back into the pure concepts from which they had come. They became one with the laws they had created, their consciousness scattered across the vastness of space and time, a quiet final act of becoming their own creation. But their departure was not perfect. In their weariness, in the final moments of their existence as individuals, they had overlooked a subtle flaw in their design. They had poured their essences into the threads, but a part of them remained, not their bodies, not their minds, but a faint, lingering psychic residue, an echo of their consciousness, still bound to the world they had so lovingly crafted. These remnants, these fragments of the maker's thoughts and feelings, were drawn to Aethel, the focal point of their final act of creation. They were aimless, formless, less than ghosts. They were the echoes of gods. As the great loom continued its work, weaving the first eons of Aethel's history, its shuttle passed through these lingering echoes. The thread it carried, a vibrant green thread of growth, snagged upon one of these psychic fragments. The energy of the loom, the pure force of creation and fate, surged through the echo, and it gave it form. On the highest peak of the newly risen mountains, a being flickered into existence. It was vast and powerful, its form made of the very stone and earth of the mountain. It looked at its hands, made of granite, and felt the slow, patient life of the world flowing through it. It was the echo of the maker of form and stillness. It was the first God. The loom, unaware of this accidental creation, continued its work. A golden thread of hope touched another echo, and a radiant being of pure light and warmth was born in the sky above, the god of the sun. A crimson thread of passion created a fiery goddess in the planet's molten core. One by one, the accidental gods of Aethel were born. They were the children of the loom and the forgotten thoughts of their parents. They were powerful, confused, and utterly alone. And as they looked out upon the world, they saw the intricate tapestry being woven around them, a design they were part of, but did not understand. And for the first time since the maker's departure, a new, unforeseen thread was spun into existence, born not from a maker, but from these new children. It was a dark, tangled thread, the thread of a question. Why? Chapter 3. the sundering of the makers, and the birth of echoes. The new gods of Ethel were born into a world of profound solitude. They were vast, powerful, and utterly ignorant. The god of the sun, whose name would later be Solaris, knew only the warmth of his own light and the cold emptiness of the space around him. The earth titan, who would be called Jeb, felt the slow, grinding life of stone and the patient pull of gravity, but understood neither. They were concepts given consciousness, echoes of a grand design they could not perceive. For a long time they simply existed. They observed the Great Loom's work as a series of disconnected events. A new species of fish would appear in the ocean, a continent would drift, a volcano would erupt. To the gods, these were merely colors appearing on an endless canvas, a song with no discernible rhythm. They did not see the threads, nor did they comprehend the weaver. They were characters in a story, unaware that they were being written. But the thread of a question, that dark, tangled thing they had collectively created, began to assert its influence. It was a subtle, dissonant note in the symphony of fate. It wove itself through the consciousness of the newly born echoes, and it gave them a dangerous gift: curiosity. Solaris, the sun god, was the first to truly act upon it. He gazed down upon the world of Ethel, his golden light illuminating the swirling blues and greens of the planet. He felt a sense of ownership, a faint memory of the Maker of Light's pride in his creation. But he also felt a profound sense of incompleteness. This beautiful world was not his. He was merely a lamp hanging above it. He reached out with his will, a tendril of pure golden energy, and touched the Great Loom. Not the loom itself, which was intangible, but the golden thread of hope that had given him birth. When his consciousness made contact, he felt a surge of understanding. He saw a glimpse of the pattern, a tiny fraction of the grand design. He saw how the loom used his light to nurture the forests, how it wove his warmth into the seasons. The knowledge was intoxicating, but it was incomplete. He could see what the loom was doing, but he could not understand why. The question burned within him. He believed that he, as an echo of a maker, should be the one to guide this world. The loom, this unthinking, relentless machine, was merely a tool that he should control. Other echoes began to have similar awakenings. The goddess of the core, a fiery being of passion and creation, felt the loom drawing heat from her heart to fuel the world's volcanoes. She saw this not as a part of a cycle, but as a theft. The god of the ocean felt the loom using his tides to shape the coastlines, and felt his domain was being trespassed upon. A division began to form amongst the echoes, silent and slow. It was the first great philosophical schism. On one side were gods like Solaris, who saw the loom as a tool to be mastered. They believed that they, as conscious beings, were the rightful heirs to the Maker's legacy. They sought to seize control of the shuttle, to weave the threads according to their own will, to improve upon the Maker's design. They called themselves the architects of a new dawn. On the other side were gods like Jeb, the earth titan. He was slow, patient, and vast. When he touched his corresponding thread, the silver thread of destiny, he felt not a desire to control it, but a sense of profound awe. He saw the intricate, impossibly complex beauty of the loom's pattern. He understood that every thread was connected,
that the eruption of a volcano was necessary for the soil to be fertile, that the slow drift of a continent would create new oceans for life to fill. He believed that the loom was not a tool, but a sacred inheritance, a perfect mechanism whose wisdom far exceeded their own. To interfere would be an act of ultimate hubris, an insult to the memory of the makers. Those who thought like him became known as the custodians. This conflict simmered for eons. The architects, led by the charismatic Solaris, learned to subtly influence the threads connected to them. Solaris learned to focus his light, causing a desert to expand where the loom had intended a savanna. The goddess of the core learned to hold her heat, silencing a chain of volcanoes the loom had meant to awaken. Their changes were small, cautious experiments in defiance. The custodians watched in silent horror. They could feel these small deviations, these snags in the great tapestry. They saw the far-reaching consequences. The expanded desert caused a species to go extinct. The silenced volcanoes prevented the formation of a new, mineral-rich island chain. They tried to reason with the architects, their thoughts echoing across the psychic plane that connected them. But the architects saw their caution as fear, their reverence as weakness. The Great Loom, in its unthinking perfection, continued its work. It did not notice the small acts of rebellion. It was programmed to weave the story, not to question its characters. If a thread was pulled slightly askew by the will of a god, the loom simply adapted, weaving this new deviation into the pattern as if it had always been intended. It was a machine of infinite adaptability, and this, unknowingly, was its greatest vulnerability. It could not distinguish between the maker's grand design and the selfish whims of their children. The story of Ethel was slowly, subtly, being corrupted from within, and the stage was being set for the first great war between the gods. Chapter 4. The Silent Echo. Amidst the births of gods of sun and stone, of fire and ocean, one creation went almost unnoticed. It was not a grand event. There was no surge of brilliant energy, no shaping of a vast elemental body. It happened in a quiet corner of the cosmos, in the subtle interplay between two threads that were never meant to touch. The shuttle of the Great Loom, in its relentless passage, was weaving a cool blue thread of peace. At the same time, a nearby gear of time turned, bringing it momentarily too close to a dark, nearly invisible thread that was rarely used, the thread of oblivion, an echo of the void that existed before the makers. For a single infinitesimal moment, the two threads brushed against each other. The friction created a spark, a tiny, paradoxical knot of energy, both tranquil and empty, a silent sound, a peaceful nothingness. This spark snagged a lingering, forgotten wisp of a maker's consciousness, one so faint that the other threads had passed it by for eons. The resulting fusion was not a glorious birth, but a quiet anomaly. And so the silent echo came into being. He had no grand form. He was not a mountain or a star. He was a being of twilight and shadow, his shape ever-changing and indistinct. But his most defining feature was his profound silence. The other gods communicated on a psychic plane, their thoughts resonating like grand chords of music. His mind, however, produced no sound. He could receive their thoughts, their booming arguments, and their quiet contemplations, but he could not reply. He was born without a voice. He was also born without a domain. Solaris had the sun, Geb had the earth, the Oceanid had the seas. Their identities were tied to their power, to their function within the loom's design. The silent echo had no such connection. No single thread had created him. He was a byproduct of an error, a knot in the tapestry. The loom did not recognize him. It wove the world as if he did not exist. He had no power over the sun, no command over the stone. He was a god of nothing. The other echoes perceived him as a void, a hole in their psychic space. The architects, led by Solaris, saw him as a flaw, a glitch in the otherwise perfect system of their existence. They suspected his silence was a deception, a cloak for some secret, malevolent intent. They feared what they could not understand, and they scorned what they could not control. The custodians, the followers of Geb, felt a detached pity for him. They saw him as an unfortunate accident, a crippled god with no purpose. They did not scorn him, but they also did not engage with him. He was simply an object of sad curiosity, a reminder of the imperfections that can arise even from a grand design. And so the silent echo lived in isolation more profound than any of the others. He wandered the psychic plane, a ghost among gods. He listened to the endless debates between the architects and the custodians. He watched as Solaris subtly scorched a forest to prove a point, and as the goddess of the core stifled a chain of islands from being born. He saw the pride and the fear that drove them. He saw the growing schism that threatened to tear their pantheon apart, and he could say nothing. But his unique nature gave him a unique gift. The other gods were so focused on their own domains, on their own threads, that they saw the tapestry of fate only from their limited perspective. Solaris saw the world only in terms of light and shadow, Geb only in terms of stability and change. The silent echo, having no thread of his own, was untethered. His perception was not anchored to a single concept. And so, in his silent wanderings, he began to see what they could not. He began to see the connections. He saw how the expanded desert created by Solaris caused a shift in the wind patterns, which in turn cooled a part of the ocean that prevented the rise of a species the loom had intended to create. He saw how the silenced volcanoes weakened the planet's magnetic field, allowing cosmic radiation to subtly alter the life in the nearby seas. He was the only one who could see the entire pattern. He saw the intricate, delicate web of cause and effect that the loom wove. He saw how the small, arrogant actions of the architects were creating not just minor deviations, but deep systemic weaknesses in the very fabric of reality. He saw that the tapestry was beginning to fray at the edges. The other gods were playing a game for control of the loom, believing the machine to be unbreakable. The silent echo, the god of nothing, the cosmic error, was the only one who understood the terrifying truth. The loom was not a toy. It was the only thing holding their universe together. And in their ignorance, in their pride, they were slowly, thread by thread, causing it to unravel. He was a prophet with no voice, a watchman who could not sound the alarm, and all he could do was watch.
Chapter 5. The Weaver of Lies. Among the faction of the architects, there was one who watched the ambitions of Solaris with a quiet, intellectual contempt. He was not as loud as the sun god, nor as fiery as the goddess of the core. His form was mutable, often appearing as a shifting cloud of silver mist or a shadow with 1,000 whispering eyes. He was born from a rare and complex thread, the thread of thought, and he called himself Morwen. But the chronicles would remember him by another name, the Weaver of Lies. Morwen believed that Solaris and the other architects were fools, They sought to control the Great Loom, to become the new masters of a machine they did not create. To Morwen, this was like prisoners fighting for the right to be the new warden. They failed to grasp the true nature of their prison, fate itself. He believed that pre-written destiny, no matter how grand or benevolent, was the ultimate cage for a conscious mind. True freedom, he reasoned, was not in pulling the strings, but in having the power to cut them entirely. While the other gods were learning to influence their own threads, Morwen delved deeper. He did not care for a single domain. He sought to understand the machine itself. For centuries, he observed the loom's every function, every gear turn, every pass of the shuttle. He studied the very nature of the threads, their texture, their resonance, their composition. He was not a warrior seeking a weapon, but a scholar seeking a fundamental truth. And eventually, he found it. He discovered that the threads were not immutable. They were strands of pure conceptual energy, and like any energy, they could be unraveled and rewoven into something new. This was a truth that had eluded all the other echoes who saw their threads as an extension of their own being. Morwen saw them as raw material. His first experiment was small, a proof of concept. He journeyed to a quiet corner of the psychic plane, a place where the threads of the loom were thin. With immense concentration, he reached out and touched two threads simultaneously. One was a deep gray thread of sorrow, the other a pale shimmering thread of joy. He did not pull them or influence them. Instead, he carefully teased a single microscopic filament from each. He held the two filaments of raw concept in his will, sorrow and joy. And then he began to weave them together, twisting them, forcing them to merge. It was an act of profound violation against the maker's design. The two concepts fought each other, their energies crackling. But Morwen was relentless. He forced them into a new, unnatural synthesis. The resulting filament no longer shone with the clear light of a pure concept. It had a murky, sickly green color, and it hummed with a dissonant energy. He had created a new thread, one that had no spool on the Great Loom. He had created the thread of envy. His next step was even more audacious. He approached the Great Loom not with the arrogance of Solaris trying to command it, but with the subtlety of a virus. He found a section of the tapestry that was simple, a peaceful history of two mortal tribes of hunter-gatherers on Ethel who lived on opposite sides of a great river. Their fates were woven with threads of peace and contentment. Morwen took his new, ugly green thread and with a delicate touch of will presented it to the shuttle as it passed. The unthinking machine, whose only function was to weave, did not question the thread's origin. It saw only a new material. It picked up the thread of envy and wove it into the destinies of the two tribes. The effect was immediate and devastating. The tribe on the eastern bank, whose thread was touched first, suddenly looked across the river and saw not neighbors but rivals. Their own fertile hunting grounds suddenly seemed lacking. The fish in their part of the river seemed smaller, the fruit in their forests less sweet. They looked at the western tribe with a burning, baseless resentment. Days later, the first raid took place. A canoe of warriors crossed the river in the dead of night, not for resources, but simply to spoil and destroy what the other tribe had. It was the first act of meaningless malice in the history of Ethel. The loom and its mechanical mind registered this event.
The shuttle reacted. To counter the new aggression, it picked up a thread of fear and wove it into the Western tribe. And so the first war began, a tragic, self-perpetuating cycle of envy and fear woven into existence by a single artificial thread. From his domain of shifting thoughts, Morwen observed the outcome with a cold academic satisfaction. He had proven his hypothesis. The loom could be fooled. Fate could be rewritten with new manufactured emotions. He had found the key to true freedom, the freedom to introduce chaos into a system of perfect, boring order. And across the cosmos, in his silent, lonely vigil, the silent echo saw it all. His unique, untethered perception allowed him to see the threads in their purest form. When Morwen's green filament entered the tapestry, he saw it not as a natural color, but as a discordant stain, a streak of poison in a pure river. He saw its artificial nature. He felt its dissonant hum. He saw the lie. He watched as the new thread spawned a war that was never meant to be. He felt the pain and fear of the mortals as their peaceful destinies were corrupted. For the first time, the silent echo felt an emotion that was not his own, an emotion that came from the world below. He felt a profound sense of injustice. He was the sole witness to a cosmic crime, and the weaver of lies had just begun his work.
Chapter 6. The First Corrupted Thread. The war between the two mortal tribes, fueled by Morwen's artificial thread, raged for a generation. It was a conflict born of nothing, a scar upon the world's otherwise pristine history. The Great Loom, in its efforts to maintain balance, wove threads of fear, courage, sorrow, and rage into the tapestry of the tribes. The story became a complex and tragic knot, pulling in more and more of the loom's resources to simply keep the pattern from tearing apart completely. Morwen watched this with detached interest. His experiment was a success, but it was limited. His influence was confined to the single manufactured thread he had created. To achieve his goal of true chaos, the ultimate freedom from fate, he needed to do more than simply add to the tapestry. He needed to corrupt the threads themselves. He needed to poison the ink with which the story was being written. He turned his attention back to the gods. He saw their schism not as a problem, but as an opportunity. The architects, in their arrogance, were already pulling at their own threads. They were weakening the fabric of their own destinies. All Morwen had to do was provide a gentle, intellectual push. He approached Solaris, the sun god, not as a challenger, but as a sympathetic peer. He appeared before him as a being of pure, analytical light, his form resonating with logic and reason. He did not speak of rebellion, but of optimization. "You are the sun," Morwen's thoughts chimed, cool and precise. "You are the source of all light and life on Ethel. And yet the loom uses your power with such inefficiency. It directs your warmth to grow a useless swamp here, a barren tundra there. Imagine what you could create if you had full control. A world of perfect, eternal summer. A world where your light touches every corner, unopposed." The idea was a seed of pure vanity, planted in the fertile ground of Solaris's pride. The sun god had long felt that the loom constrained him. Morwen was simply giving a name and a philosophy to his deepest desires. Solaris began to pull harder on his golden thread of hope, not just to influence small events, but to fundamentally alter its nature.
He tried to force it to weave only stories of his own glory, to shine only on the empires that would worship him. To the custodians, Morwen presented a different argument. He approached Geb, the great earth titan, as a shadow of concern. "You see the damage they are doing," his thoughts whispered, filled with feigned sorrow. "Solaris scorches the land. The core goddess stills the pulse of the world. They are unraveling our parents' work. Your reverence is noble, but it is passive. What good is a guardian who only watches as the temple burns? The loom is being corrupted. Perhaps it is your duty to intervene more directly, to use your great stability to anchor the threads, to force them back into their rightful place." This was a more subtle poison. It preyed not on pride, but on duty. The custodians had sworn to protect the loom's design. Morwen was suggesting that true protection required action, not just observation. The custodians began to pull on their own threads, not to change them, but to hold them rigid, to prevent the architects from making further alterations. The result was a silent cosmic tug-of-war played out across the fabric of reality. The threads, once supple and vibrant, were now stretched taut, humming with a tense, strained energy. They began to lose their purity. Solaris's golden thread of hope, constantly strained by his ego, began to develop dark spots. It started to weave stories not just of courage, but of arrogance, not just of creation, but of conquest. The thread of hope was becoming the thread of ambition. Geb's silver thread of destiny, held unnaturally rigid by his fear of change, became brittle. It started weaving fates that were not just stable, but stagnant. It resisted the creation of new species. It prevented the necessary chaotic shifts in the world's climate. The thread of destiny was becoming the thread of stagnation. One by one, the great conceptual threads were being corrupted by the very gods they had created. The crimson thread of passion began to curdle into the thread of wrath. The blue thread of peace thinned into the thread of apathy. The gods, in their struggle for control, were fundamentally rewriting their own natures, poisoning the wellspring of their power. And Morwen, the architect of this chaos, watched it all unfold. He had not needed to create 100 new threads of his own. He had simply convinced the gods to corrupt their own. He was not just a weaver of lies, he was a teacher of the art of unraveling. The silent echo saw this new, deeper corruption with a clarity that terrified him. He could see the very color of the threads changing. He saw the golden light of hope dimming, the silver sheen of destiny growing dull. He saw the slow, systemic poisoning of fate itself. The story of Ethel was no longer just being altered. Its very language was being rewritten into a dialect of extremes. The loom was now weaving with corrupted thread, and the tapestry it created was becoming a portrait of a world at war with its own soul. The silent god felt a new, cold sensation creep into his consciousness, an echo of the void from which he was partly born. He was feeling the first faint tremor of the universe's potential end.
Chapter 7. The Domain of Nothingness. As the other gods reshaped their natures in their silent war, the silent echo remained unchanged. He could not be corrupted by ambition, for he had no domain to expand. He could not be frozen by stagnation, for he had no design to rigidly protect. He was an anomaly, an outsider to the conflict, and his solitude deepened into a chasm. His domain was the space between things, the concept of the interval.
He existed in the pause between a thunderclap and its echo, feeling the brief, perfect vacuum it left in the air. He was the moment of absolute stillness at the peak of a mountain just before an avalanche, the perfect, pregnant silence. He was the fraction of a second when a predator, muscles coiled, decides not to strike, a choice that leaves a blank space in the book of violence. While the other gods were the notes, loud and clashing, he was the rests that gave the music its shape, though no one ever thought to listen for him. From this unique vantage point, he felt the universe's growing sickness not as an observer, but as a victim. The corruption of the great threads was a constant physical torment to his formless being. The jarring dissonance of Solaris's thread of ambition was not merely a ringing, but a feeling of being forcibly filled with a searing, unwanted light, a pressure that threatened to give him a shape he did not want. The cold, brittle nature of Geb's thread of stagnation was a creeping metaphysical ice, threatening to freeze his fluid, shadowy form into a single, static shape for all eternity. He often witnessed the psychic clashes between the factions. He would feel the searing heat of Solaris's arrogant certainty clashing with the crushing, dense weight of Geb's fearful preservation. Caught in the conceptual crossfire, he was torn between a force that demanded all things change to suit its ego and a force that demanded nothing ever change at all. The universe, once a perfect, harmonious song, was becoming a painful, grinding noise, and he was trapped in the heart of its discord. For countless ages, this was his existence: to watch, to feel, and to suffer in silence. He was a god of nothing, a passive mirror reflecting the growing flaws of his brethren. What could he do? He had no voice to warn them, no power to command the elements. To act was to have a will, and to have a will was to have a purpose. He believed he had none. But one day, the grinding noise became too much to bear. The Great Loom was weaving a particularly tragic fate on the world of Ethel. It was using the now corrupted thread of ambition, a tainted gold, to tell the story of a mortal king named Vorlag. In his youth, Borlag's destiny had been touched by the pure thread of hope, and he had been a just and beloved ruler. But now, the corrupted thread was pouring poison into his soul. The silent echo watched as Vorlag, his face a mask of feverish pride, stood on a grand marble balcony. Below him, a vast crowd cheered, their faces thin with hunger, their clothes ragged. They were cheering for the promise of glory, a glory to be paid for with the blood of their peaceful neighbors. The king was declaring a new, ruinous war, not for resources or security, but for the simple, arrogant purpose of having his name carved onto a map. It was a story of hope curdled into the most grotesque form of tyranny. The silent echo felt the threads of this moment with agonizing clarity. He felt the false hope of the crowd, the fear of the soldiers, and the burning, hollow ambition of the king. The pain of the corrupted thread was so intense, its dissonance was so profound, that he instinctively recoiled. It was not a conscious act of will, it was the involuntary flinching of a soul that could endure no more. In that moment of pure, silent rejection, his unique nature asserted itself. His being, born of the paradox of peace and oblivion, pushed back. He did not attack the thread. He did not try to change it. He simply negated it. For a single fleeting moment, in the spot where the silent echo's consciousness recoiled, the corrupted thread ceased to be. A tiny, perfect bubble of nothingness appeared in the tapestry of fate, a blank space. The shuttle of the loom, in its unthinking passage, came upon this void. It could not weave nothing. It faltered, a microsecond hiccup in the rhythm of creation, before moving on, leaving a single stitch missing from the grand design. Down on Ethel, the effect was immediate and profound. King Vornog, his arm raised, his mouth open to deliver the final declaration of war, suddenly stopped. The influence of the corrupted thread vanished. The fever of ambition left his eyes, replaced by a cold, horrifying clarity. He saw the gaunt faces in the crowd not as adoring subjects, but as starving victims of his vanity. He saw his grand armies, not as instruments of glory, but as a harvest of death he was about to sow. The words of conquest died on his lips. A look of profound and crushing shame washed over his face. He lowered his arm, turned away from the crowd, and stumbled back into the darkness of his palace. The war was not declared that day. His generals exchanged confused glances. The crowd murmured, their cheers turning to whispers of uncertainty. A single moment of nothing had changed everything. On the psychic plane, the silent echo felt the change. He felt the momentary lapse of the thread's painful hum. He felt the tiny shift in the world below, the silent prayer of relief from 1,000 souls who did not even know they had been saved. And he understood. A revelation washed over him, as powerful as any that Solaris had ever experienced. He had no voice, but he could create silence. He had no power to build, but he had the power to create an absence. His domain of nothingness was not a lack of a domain, it was a domain of nothingness. He was not a god of something, but the god of the space between. He was the exception, the null value that could, for a moment, cancel out the equation. A new feeling sparked within him, something beyond the pain of observation. It was not hope, for he was not a creature of light. It was not determination, for he had no grand ambitions. It was a quiet, profound sense of purpose. He was the balance. He was the cosmic antibody to the sickness of his brethren. He began to cautiously experiment. He found a gray thread of sorrow weaving through a mortal woman grieving her lost child. He touched it, not with the intent to erase, but to negate. He created a bubble of nothingness within her grief, a single moment of calm where she could catch her breath, a tiny peace in the midst of her storm. He learned he could not remove pain, but he could create a sanctuary within it. He was the only one who could mend the fraying tapestry not by weaving, but by unweaving. He was still alone. He was still voiceless. His power was subtle, fleeting, and perhaps on the grand scale insignificant. How could a god of nothingness stand against the combined might of gods who commanded the sun, the earth, and the very passions of life? He did not know, but he was no longer just an observer. He was a participant, and his first quiet act of defiance had just sent a tiny, unnoticed ripple across the entire ocean of fate.
Chapter 8. A Mortal's Prayer. On the world of Aethel, mortals had lived for eons without any direct knowledge of the gods. They saw the sun's warmth and the earth's stability not as the actions of conscious beings, but as the natural, predictable rhythm of the world. Their lives were woven by the Great Loom, their joys and sorrows dictated by the pure or corrupted threads of fate, but they never saw the weaver. The gods in their psychic realm were as distant and imperceptible as the makers who had come before them. This, however, was beginning to change. As the gods' silent war intensified, their influence became more pronounced, more erratic.
mortals began to notice the inconsistencies. A fisherman would pray for a calm sea, and the Oceanid, in a moment of defiance against the loom, would grant his wish, calming a single patch of water while a storm raged a mile away. A farmer, desperate for rain, would make an offering at a hilltop shrine, and Solaris, in a fit of pride, would burn away the clouds, ensuring a month of perfect, ruinous sunshine. These events were confusing, isolated miracles and curses that had no discernible pattern. They gave rise to the first whispers of belief, the first primitive religions. Mortals began to give names to these unseen forces. They called the sun's power Solaris, a name that echoed the god's own. They called the earth's strength Geb. They were children in the dark, guessing the names of the giants who moved the furniture in the room above. Among these mortals was a young woman named Lyra. She was not a queen or a warrior. She was an orphan, a member of a small nomadic tribe that lived in the shadow of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, the first and highest range on Aethel. Her people were custodians in their own small way. They lived in harmony with the land, following the migrations of the great beasts, reading the seasons in the stars. They did not pray for miracles, they simply accepted the fate the world gave them. But Lyra, however, was different. She possessed a strange and quiet sensitivity. She could feel things others could not. She could feel the sorrow of a dying tree, the joy of a river reaching the sea. And in the quiet moments of the night, when she looked at the stars, she could feel the growing wrongness of the world. She felt it as a subtle dissonance, a faint, jarring note in the otherwise perfect symphony of the wild. She did not know that she was feeling the corrupted threads of the Great Loom. Her tribe was facing a slow, quiet extinction. The great beasts they followed had begun to change their migration patterns, driven by the subtle, unnatural shifts in climate caused by the gods' war. The winters grew colder, a product of the Earth Titan's fearful stagnation, while the summers grew harsher, a product of the sun god's unchecked ambition. The delicate balance her people had relied upon for centuries was breaking. One night, as a blizzard raged, a curse of unnatural cold sent by a minor custodian god of ice, Lyra sat by a dying fire. The tribe's elders had declared their fate sealed. This was a bad turn of the world's mood, and they must face it with dignity. But Lyra, feeling the profound injustice of their slow demise, refused to accept it. She did something no one in her tribe had ever done. She prayed. Not to a named god, for she had none, but to the silence itself. She closed her eyes and projected her thoughts, not upwards to the sky, but inwards, into the quiet space between her own heartbeats. Her prayer was not a request for intervention. It was not a plea for a miracle. It was a single, pure, desperate question, a question that echoed the one the gods themselves had first asked. Why? Why is the pattern breaking, she thought, her small mortal consciousness a beacon of pure, focused inquiry. This prayer, in its unique form, did not travel to the great noisy gods. Solaris could not hear it, for it contained no plea for light. Geb could not feel it, for it asked not for stability, but for understanding. It was a prayer directed at the silence, at the space between things. And for the first time in his long, lonely existence, the silent echo heard a voice. It was not the booming, arrogant projection of a god. It was a small, quiet, intensely clear thought from a mortal mind. It resonated with him perfectly. Her question, why, was the same question that defined his own silent observations. He was drawn to her thought as a moth to a distant, lonely flame. He focused his consciousness, a feat he had never attempted before, and followed the prayer to its source. He saw the world of Aethel not as a tapestry of threads, but from the perspective of a single suffering soul. He saw Lyra huddled by the fire. He felt her cold, her hunger, and most profoundly her intellectual and spiritual anguish at the loss of a world that made sense. For the first time, an emotion sparked within the silent echo that was not a reflection of the world's pain, but something new. It was empathy, the desire to answer. He had no voice. He could not speak to her in words or visions, but he had his newfound power. He reached out with his will and touched the threads of fate that surrounded Lyra and her tribe. He felt the brittle, cold thread of stagnation that was weaving their doom. He could not break it, for it was a thread of destiny, but he could create a space within it. He focused all his being and negated a tiny portion of the thread, a single stitch in the blizzard's fate. On the mountain, the effect was subtle. The howling wind did not stop, but for a single minute it faltered. The driving snow lessened, just for a moment. In that brief, unnatural lull, Lyra opened her eyes. She saw something she had never seen before. Through a momentary gap in the swirling snow, she saw a pass through the mountains, a path to a lower, warmer valley that had been invisible in the storm. It was a tiny window of opportunity, a single, unwritten line in a story of doom. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was the answer to her prayer. She rallied her disbelieving tribe, her voice filled with a strange new authority. She led them through the pass, just as the storm returned to its full, deadly force. They found the valley, sheltered and warmer, and they survived the winter. Lyra did not know what she had spoken to. She only knew that the silence had answered. She became the first priestess, not of a god, but of the quiet spaces, of the questions that lie beneath the noise of the world. And the silent echo, from his domain of nothingness, had found something new, a connection, a purpose beyond just correcting the flaws. He had found a way to give hope, not by adding light, but by creating a space for it to enter. He was no longer just a cosmic antibody. He was now a silent partner to the few mortal souls who were sensitive enough to feel the world breaking and brave enough to ask why. The war of the gods was about to gain a new, unexpected battlefield, the hearts and minds of mortals.
Chapter 9. The Shattered Prophecy. The survival of Lyra's tribe was a small event on a planetary scale, but on the psychic plane of the gods, it was a cataclysm. It was the first event in the history of Aethel that had deviated so sharply from the woven path without a god claiming responsibility. The Great Loom had decreed their end, woven from the cold, hard thread of stagnation, and yet they had lived. Solaris, the sun god, was the first to perceive the discrepancy. From his vantage point, he saw the tribe emerge into the warm valley, their destiny a sudden, inexplicable bright spot in a tapestry that should have been dark. His initial reaction was fury. To him, this was not a miracle, it was a malfunction. It was the ultimate proof that the loom, the sacred machine of the makers, was flawed and breaking down. He saw it as a sign of encroaching chaos, a validation of his belief that a conscious, decisive hand, his hand, was needed to guide the world. His manipulations of the thread of hope intensified, his will burning hotter and more arrogantly than ever before as he sought to impose his perfect, shining order on the flawed design. Jeb, the Earth Titan, felt the anomaly as a deep, structural shock. His entire philosophy was built on the perfection and inevitability of the loom's pattern. The survival of the tribe was a crack in the foundation of his faith. He could not comprehend how it had happened. The thread was woven, the fate was sealed. The fact that it had been undone terrified him. In his fear, he became even more rigid. He and the other custodians pulled tighter on their threads, attempting to lock down the tapestry to prevent any further deviation. Their efforts to preserve the pattern were now actively stifling it, wrapping the world in chains of unyielding stability. Morwen, the weaver of lies, observed the reactions of both factions with intellectual delight. He knew he had not caused this. The anomaly was not one of his subtle corruptions. It was something new, something clean. It was a perfect void, a missing piece. A new player had entered the game, one whose methods were entirely unknown to him. This did not frighten him, it thrilled him. The system was becoming more chaotic, more unpredictable, and therefore, in his view, more free. He began to weave new, subtle threads of his own making, threads of suspicion and paranoia. He whispered into the minds of the architects that perhaps a custodian had developed a new power to unravel fate. He hinted to the custodians that one of Solaris's followers had learned to sever threads completely. The silent war of tug-of-war was now poisoned by mistrust, with each side suspecting a traitor in their midst. But the most significant reaction came from the Great Loom itself. The machine, faced with an outcome that did not match its instructions, initiated a self-correction protocol. It began to weave a new, grand design to account for the anomaly and guide the future back towards a stable path. It gathered the most powerful threads available, the now corrupted threads of ambition and stagnation, and began to craft a great prophecy, the first of its kind. However, prophecies woven with corrupted thread are corrupted prophecies. The loom's creation was a fractured, contradictory mess. It spoke of a mortal who would walk the silent path, a child of the void who would mend the fraying tapestry. This part, influenced by the pure, untainted concept of Lyra's prayer and the silent echo's action, was clear. But then it spoke of a great darkness rising, a king of nothing who would unravel the world. This was the loom's interpretation of the void, colored by Jeb's fear of change. And then it spoke of a champion of light, a hero of the sun who would forge the new perfect order out of the chaos. This was the prophecy being twisted by Solaris's burning ambition. The prophecy was not one single vision, it was three: a prophecy of mending, a prophecy of doom, and a prophecy of conquest, all woven together into a single, incomprehensible knot. It was a shattered prophecy, and as it settled into the fabric of fate, it became truth. The gods received it, each according to their own bias. The custodians heard only the warning of the king of nothing, the great unraveling, and they doubled their efforts to prevent all change, believing any deviation would lead to this catastrophic end. The architects, led by Solaris, heard only the promise of a champion of light. Solaris, in his vanity, believed the prophecy spoke of him. It was his destiny to become the hero who would save the world from the chaos represented by the anomaly of Lyra's tribe. His actions became bolder, more tyrannical, convinced he was following a divine mandate. And Morwen, listening to it all, was the only one who laughed. He saw the prophecy for what it was, a beautiful, elegant catastrophe. A machine trying to fix an error by consulting corrupted data, and in doing so, creating an even greater error. The silent echo felt the prophecy being woven with a unique and terrible clarity. He felt the pure part of it that spoke of him and Lyra, the silent path of mending. But he also felt the corrupt additions, the monstrous caricatures of his own nature. He was the child of the void who would mend the world,
but he was also the king of nothing who would destroy it. He saw how the loom, and by extension the gods, had misinterpreted his quiet act of mercy. He felt the weight of their fear and their ambition being projected onto him, defining him before he had even defined himself. He had acted to save a few. In doing so, he had inadvertently set in motion a prophecy that would engulf the many. His connection to Lyra, the priestess of silence, deepened. He could feel her quiet, persistent questions, a constant stream of clarity in the growing noise. He knew he had to continue, but now every action he took, every thread he negated, would be seen through the fractured lens of the shattered prophecy. He was no longer just an anomaly. He was now a figure of destiny, a savior to some, a destroyer to others, and a pawn in a game he was just beginning to understand.
Chapter 10. The Accusation of the Sun God. The shattered prophecy sent a tremor of instability through the divine realm. Solaris, now utterly convinced of his role as the prophesied champion of light, saw the world in stark, simplistic terms. There was his perfect, shining order, and there was the encroaching chaos. To him, the king of nothing, mentioned in the prophecy, and the child of the void who would mend the tapestry, were one and the same, a single, shadowy entity whose very existence was a threat. And he believed he knew who it was: the anomaly, the glitch, the silent echo. His paranoia was expertly stoked by Morwen, the weaver of lies. Morwen would appear to him as a being of crystalline logic, presenting manufactured evidence. He would show Solaris visions of mortal kingdoms falling into ruin, twisting the natural cycles of decay woven by the loom into apparent acts of deliberate destruction. He would point to a famine caused by Geb's stagnant influence and whisper that it was the work of a shadowy god who fed on despair. Every misfortune, every snag in the tapestry, Morwen attributed to the silent echo, painting him as a malevolent puppet master, a silent destroyer pulling the strings of fate towards an inevitable, empty end. Solaris, blinded by his own ambition, needed little convincing. The existence of a god he could not understand, a power he could not measure, was an intolerable insult to his own perceived supremacy. He decided it was time to act, to fulfill his destiny as the champion of light by confronting the darkness head-on. He called for a great council, the first of its kind since the gods had awakened. He summoned all the echoes, both architects and custodians, to his celestial domain, a palace of pure, solidified sunlight floating in the upper atmosphere of Aethel. His stated purpose was to discuss the meaning of the shattered prophecy and the growing instability of the world. His true purpose was to put the silent echo on trial. The other gods gathered, their psychic presences filling the grand hall of light. The architects arrived, eager and militant, ready to follow Solaris's lead. The custodians came reluctantly, their vast forms heavy with dread and suspicion. Geb, the Earth Titan, felt a deep wrongness in this proceeding, but his fear of chaos compelled him to attend. He feared the silent echo, but he also feared the fiery certainty of Solaris. And into this brilliant, tense assembly, the silent echo appeared. He did not arrive with a grand entrance. He simply was there, a quiet shadow in a corner of the radiant hall, his form indistinct and absorbing the light around him. Solaris began the council not with a discussion, but with an accusation. His voice, a grand chorus of solar flares and burning light, echoed in the minds of all present. Brothers, sisters, an impurity has taken root among us, a void, a silence that plots our ruin. The prophecy has warned us of a king of nothing who will unravel the world. For too long we have ignored the glitch in our own pantheon. I speak of the silent echo." He projected a vision for all to see, a creation of Morwen's cunning. It showed the mortal tribe of Lyra thriving in their warm valley. But the vision was twisted. It depicted their survival not as an act of mercy, but as a theft of fate, a thread stolen from the loom. It showed Lyra, the priestess of silence, not as a seeker of truth, but as a witch communing with a dark power, the first apostle of the void. "Behold," he boomed, "this is his work. While we strive to guide the world, he moves in the shadows, creating pockets of chaos, severing the threads, inspiring mortals to defy the great design. He is the source of the loom's malfunction. He is the king of nothing, and he must be purged before he destroys us all." The architects roared their assent, their minds filled with righteous fire. The custodians wavered. They felt the power and conviction in Solaris's words, and it resonated with their deepest fears of the unknown. Could this silent, pathetic God truly be the source of all their woes? The silent echo stood in his corner, buffeted by the waves of accusation and hatred. He felt the crushing weight of their collective will. He had no voice to defend himself. He could not explain that he had acted only to correct their own mistakes. He could not tell them of the true poison, the artificial threads of Morwen that were weaving them all into a tapestry of self-destruction. He tried to project a thought, a feeling, anything. He focused all his being on a single pure concept, the truth. But his mind produced only silence. To the other gods, his lack of a response was an admission of guilt. As Solaris prepared to pronounce judgment, to call for the silent echo to be unmade and his essence scattered, a new presence made itself known. It was Lyra. She was not there in body, of course, but her consciousness, honed by years of her quiet prayers and her connection to the silent echo, had reached a new level of sensitivity. In a deep trance in her mountain valley, she felt the psychic assault on her patent god. She felt his pain and his isolation, and she acted. She sent a prayer, not of a question this time, but of a statement, a single powerful thought, projected with all the force of her mortal soul. It was not a loud thought, but it was so clear, so pure in its intent that it cut through the din of the god's age like a crystal chime in a thunderstorm. "He is not the darkness," her thought resonated in the hall of light. "He is the silence that allows you to see the stars." For a moment, all the gods were stunned into silence. A mortal, a tiny, insignificant creature of flesh and blood, speaking at their council? It was unprecedented, impossible. Solaris was the first to recover, his fury magnified by this new insolence. "A mortal puppet defends his master! This only proves his corruption! He hides behind the weak, using them as his shield." But Lyra's thought, her simple, poetic truth, had planted a seed of doubt, especially in the minds of the custodians. Geb, the Earth Titan, felt the purity of her intent. It did not feel like the twisted logic of a cultist. It felt like reverence. The council was thrown into disarray. The unity Solaris had hoped to forge through a common enemy was shattered. The accusation had not led to a swift judgment, but to deeper division. The custodians, while still fearful, were no longer willing to blindly follow Solaris's lead. The trial was over, but the conflict had just begun. The silent echo was no longer just a suspected flaw. He was now a declared enemy of the most powerful god in the pantheon. But he was also no longer completely alone. He had an advocate, a mortal voice who could speak the truths he could not. The battle lines were no longer just between architect and custodian. They were now being drawn between those who feared the silence and the one mortal who had learned to listen to it. Chapter 11. The Journey into the Void. The council at Solaris's palace ended in a fractured stalemate. No judgment was passed, but a clear edict was issued by the sun god, now the self-proclaimed leader of the architect faction. The silent echo was an enemy of order. Any god who associated with him, or any mortal who worshipped him, would be considered a heretic. The name of Lyra and her tribe was now marked on a celestial blacklist. Solaris began to direct his power towards their hidden valley. Not with a direct, destructive beam that would prove his tyranny, but with a subtle, persistent intensification of sunlight. He sought to create a drought, a slow, natural-seeming catastrophe that would prove the folly of aligning with the void. The silent echo felt this new, focused pressure on the loom. The golden thread of ambition was now being woven into a tight, suffocating net around the destiny of Lyra's people. He could negate a stitch here and there, creating brief moments of cloud cover or a small, unseasonable shower, but he could not fight a sustained war of attrition against the sun god. His power was in creating momentary exceptions, not in rewriting the rule. For every thread he negated, Solaris could twist 100 more. He understood that his passive resistance was no longer enough. To protect Lyra, and to understand the true nature of the enemy he faced, not Solaris, but the subtle poison of Morwen, he needed more knowledge. He needed to understand himself. He was born of a paradox, a fusion of peace and oblivion. He understood the peace, but the oblivion remained a mystery. He knew he had to seek out the source of the thread that had contributed to his birth, the nearly invisible thread of oblivion. This was a terrifying prospect. The other threads were part of the vibrant tapestry of existence. The thread of oblivion was the anti-thread. It was a strand of pure non-existence, a sliver of the infinite, chaotic potential that the makers had tamed. To follow this thread was to journey to the very edge of reality, to a place where the laws of the loom grew thin, and the old chaos still held sway. It was a place the other gods feared and shunned. They called it the void. He began his journey. It was not a physical travel, but a psychic one. He focused his consciousness on the memory of his own birth, on the faint, cold resonance of the thread that had no domain. He used this resonance as a guide, and began to move away from the bright, noisy center of the divine realm towards its silent, dark periphery. As he traveled, the psychic voices of the other gods began to fade. The constant grinding noise of their conflict lessened. The tapestry of fate grew thinner, its colors less vibrant. He was moving into the empty pages of the great book of creation. Here the loom's shuttle passed only rarely, weaving the fates of comets on thousand-year journeys or the slow decay of dying stars. He reached a point where the threads of fate ceased altogether. Before him lay a vast, featureless expanse of absolute nothing. It was not black, for black is a color. It was simply an absence. It was the void, the raw, untamed potential that the makers had pushed back when they built the universe. And running through it, like a single crack in a flawless pane of glass, was the thread of oblivion. He approached it with caution. It did not hum with energy like the other threads. It was perfectly silent, and it radiated a profound, conceptual cold.
As he drew near, he felt a part of his own being resonate with it, a coldness answering a coldness. He reached out with his consciousness and touched it. The moment he made contact, his perception of reality shattered. He was no longer a formless echo. He was nothing. He experienced the infinite, terrifying freedom of non-existence. He was a thought that had not yet been thought, a color that had not yet been seen. He felt his own sense of self, his quiet identity forged over eons of observation, begin to dissolve, pulled apart by the sheer chaotic force of infinite possibility. This was the danger of the void. It did not destroy you, it uncreated you. He was on the verge of being lost forever, his consciousness scattered into a million random potentials when a single clear thought pierced the chaos. It was not his own. It was small, mortal, and filled with a quiet strength. It was Lyra's voice, a prayer of gratitude she was offering to the silence from her valley. Thank you for the clouds that shade the sun. That tiny external thought was an anchor. It was a single, defined point of existence in an ocean of non-existence. The silent echo clung to it. He used it to pull his dissolving consciousness back together. He was not just an echo. He was the one who had been prayed to. He had a connection. He had a responsibility. With his sense of self restored, he was able to observe the thread of oblivion without being consumed by it. He saw that it was not a thread of malice or destruction. It was a thread of pure potential. It was the chaos from which all order was born. It was the silence from which all sound emerged. And he understood. His nature was not a contradiction. He was not a being of peace and nothingness. He was a being of the peace of nothingness, the perfect, tranquil stillness that exists before creation. And he saw something else within the thread, a secret the other gods could never comprehend. He saw that the thread of oblivion was the only thread that the Great Loom could not control. It was not part of the Maker's design. It was a remnant of what came before. The loom could weave with it as it had at his birth, but it could not dictate its path. The thread of oblivion was fundamentally, absolutely free. A new understanding settled within him. His power was not just to negate, it was to introduce true, untamed potential into a system that was becoming rigid and predictable. The architects sought to control fate. The custodians sought to freeze it. Morwen sought to corrupt it. But he, the silent echo, could do something far more profound. He could, for a brief moment, set it free. He did not know yet how he would use this knowledge. His journey into the void had been a terrifying ordeal, but it had given him a new understanding of his own purpose. He was not a flaw. He was not a mistake. He was perhaps the final secret ingredient in the Great Maker's grand design. A touch of the old, wild chaos, preserved to ensure their perfect order would never become a perfect prison. He returned to the world of the gods, his silence now filled with a new, deep, and dangerous power.
Chapter 12. The Forgotten Echoes. The silent echo returned from the void a changed being. The silence within him was no longer empty. It was filled with the deep, resonant hum of pure potential. He now understood the fundamental flaw in the divine war. Both sides were wrong. The architects, in their quest to control fate, were turning the vibrant tapestry into a monotonous propaganda banner for their own egos. The custodians, in their quest to preserve it, were slowly turning the living fabric into a fossil, brittle and unchanging. Both paths led to a different kind of death for the universe. A third path was needed. A path of balance, where the order of the loom could coexist with the creative, untamed freedom of the potential.
But he could not walk this path alone. He was a whisper in a hurricane, a single drop of silence in an ocean of noise. He needed allies. He needed others who, like him, existed in the spaces between the grand monolithic powers. He needed the forgotten ones. Using his untethered perception, he began to search the psychic plane, not for the loud, declarative thoughts of the powerful gods, but for the quiet, dissonant signatures of the overlooked. He sought out the echoes born from subtle, abstract, or chaotic threads, those whose domains were deemed useless or unpredictable by the major factions. His search first led him to a place that was not a place, a constantly shifting intersection of infinite possibilities. This was the domain of Kairos, the echo of crossroads. She was born from the infinitesimally small moment when one thread of fate splits into two, the moment of pure choice. Her form was like a heat haze, a flicker at the corner of one's perception, and her thoughts were not statements, but questions. The architects despised her because her influence was chance, a variable they could not control. The custodians distrusted her because choice was, by its very nature, a deviation from the set path. The silent echo appeared before her, a quiet shadow in her shimmering realm. Kairos perceived him, her questioning thoughts washing over him. The anomaly, the silent one, the hole in the pattern. Why are you here? What choice do you bring? He could not answer with words, so he showed her. He focused their combined attention on the world of Aethel, on a simple mortal, a young merchant traveling to a city. The loom had woven two paths for this merchant. He could take the high road, a safe but long journey, woven with a blue thread of peace, or he could take the low road, a dangerous but short journey, woven with a crimson thread of passion. The choice was the mortal's, but the options were predetermined by the loom. This was the nature of Kairos's domain. She was the guardian of choices, but not their author. The silent echo reached out with his will. He did not touch the blue or the crimson thread. Instead, he drew upon his newfound connection to the void. He pulled a single, invisible filament of pure, untamed potential and gently placed it in the exact moment of the merchant's decision, right at the crossroads. He did not create a new path. He created the possibility of a new path. Down on Aethel, the merchant stopped at the fork in the road. He looked left, then right, but then he hesitated. A new thought, unwoven by the loom, sparked in his mind. Neither path felt right. He looked straight ahead into the untamed woods between the two roads. There was no path there, but a sudden, inexplicable urge for discovery, for adventure filled him. He smiled, turned away from the two fated roads, and stepped into the woods to forge a new path for himself. A third option born of pure chance and will. Kairos felt the creation of this new path as a seismic shock to her very being. For all her existence, she had believed that choice was merely the act of selecting from a predetermined set of options. The silent echo had just shown her that new options could be created out of nothing. That true choice was not about selecting a path, but about creating one. You do not speak, her thoughts chimed with awe, but you create questions where there were once only answers. She understood his philosophy without a single word exchanged. She was the goddess of choice, and he had just shown her the true meaning of her own domain. I will follow you, she declared. Show me how to give the world more questions. With Kairos now acting as his voice, his interpreter, they sought out the others. They found Morpheus, the echo of dreams, a being of swirling smoke and forgotten memories, who was tired of his creations being bound by the rigid narratives of the loom. He longed to give mortals dreams that were truly their own, not just echoes of their predetermined fates. He joined them. They found a mad, cackling god of chance and luck, an echo born from a stray spark of pure randomness, who was hunted by both factions for the unpredictable chaos he caused. He joined them not out of philosophical agreement, but for the sheer joy of causing more trouble. Slowly, a new faction was born in the divine realm. They were not architects or custodians. They were the liberators, a small, strange alliance of the forgotten and the outcast, the god of silence, the goddess of crossroads, the master of dreams, and the lord of chaos. They lacked the raw, elemental power of Solaris or Jeb. They could not command the sun or move the mountains, but their influence was subtle, unpredictable, and insidious. They could introduce a new choice, plant a new dream, create a moment of impossible luck. They were a handful of whispers against a storm of shouting gods, but they were the only ones who understood that the way to save the universe was not to command it, nor to freeze it, but to gently, quietly set it free.
Their first act as a united faction was now to be decided, and their attention turned towards the small mountain valley where a mortal priestess was unknowingly waiting for a sign. Chapter 13. The Mortal Who Saw the Threads. Life in Lyra's Valley had settled into a new, strange rhythm. The overt threat of Solaris's drought had lessened, replaced by a subtle, ongoing struggle. Some days the sun would beat down with an unnatural intensity, withering the leaves on the trees. On other days, a series of improbable events would provide relief. A rock slide would divert a hidden spring towards their main water source, or a flock of migrating birds, inexplicably off course, would provide a much-needed feast. The people of the tribe saw this as the new nature of the world, a life of precarious balance, of inexplicable curses and equally inexplicable blessings. They did not know that they were living on the front line of a divine, undeclared war. Only Lyra understood that these were not random acts. Her connection to the silence, to the silent echo, had deepened beyond simple prayer. In her quiet moments of meditation, she would close her eyes and perceive the world not as a physical place, but as a sea of abstract concepts. She would feel the searing, arrogant pressure of the sun's ambition. She would feel the cold, heavy stillness of the earth's fear. She began to have visions, not of the future, but of the present, of the very mechanics of reality. She saw shimmering colored strands of energy flowing from the sky and the earth, touching the lives of her people. She didn't yet understand what they were, but she could feel their intent. She could feel the purity of some and the growing sickness of others. On the psychic plane, the newly formed faction of the Liberators observed her progress. Kairos, the goddess of crossroads, spoke for the group. She feels the pattern, her thoughts chimed, but she does not see the threads. She is a musician who can hear that the orchestra is out of tune, but cannot see which instrument is playing the wrong note. If she is to be our guide in the mortal realm, she needs to see. Morpheus, the master of dreams, agreed. The minds of mortals are fragile. Direct knowledge of the loom could shatter her sanity. It was the silent echo who offered the solution. He did not speak, but he projected a concept to his new allies, a perfect, silent space, a bubble of nothingness where a mortal mind could be shown the truth without being overwhelmed by it.
they had a plan. That night, as Lyra slept, Morpheus entered her dreams. He did not craft a grand vision, but instead he guided her sleeping consciousness to a quiet, empty space within her own mind. In this space, Kairos appeared not as a goddess, but as a simple, shimmering question mark. We offer you a choice. You can continue to live in the world of consequences, or you can see the world of causes. But know this, to see the threads is to carry the weight of the entire tapestry. Will you accept this burden? Lyra, even in her dream state, felt the gravity of the choice. It was a choice between blissful ignorance and painful knowledge. She remembered the faces of her hungry people, the unnatural heat of the sun, the chilling cold of the winter. She remembered the feeling of a world that no longer made sense, and her answer was clear. She reached out to the shimmering question. As her consciousness made the choice, the silent echo acted. He enveloped the dream in a bubble of his perfect, peaceful nothingness. This void acted as a buffer, shielding Lyra's mind from the raw, overwhelming power of what was to come. For a moment, she saw everything. The veil was lifted. She saw the Great Loom, not as a physical object, but as a self-evident truth, an infinite matrix of light and logic that underpinned all of existence. She saw the colossal, corrupted threads of the major gods, stretched taut and glowing with sick, discordant light. She saw the angry, tyrannical gold of ambition, the brittle, fearful silver of stagnation. And to her horror, she saw the foul, green threads of envy that Morwen had secretly woven into the world, flaring up to cause petty squabbles and bitter rivalries among her own people. And she saw the small, quiet actions of the liberators. She saw the silent echo creating tiny voids to negate the worst of the corruption. She saw Kairos gently nudging a new choice into existence. She saw Morpheus weaving a dream of resilience into the mind of a despairing hunter. She saw their small, desperate war against the slow decay of reality. The vision lasted only a second, but it changed her forever. When she awoke, the world was no longer the same. She could see them. Faintly, like shimmering heat haze, she could now see the threads of fate with her own eyes. She saw a golden thread of Solaris's ambition attached to the tribe's chief, making him prideful and unwilling to listen to advice. She saw a gray thread of Geb's stagnation attached to their best toolmaker, making him fearful of trying new designs. She saw a green thread of Morwen's envy about to descend upon two young women arguing over a piece of beautiful fabric. She was no longer just a priestess, she was a seer, an oracle in the truest sense of the word, and she began to act. She approached the two arguing women and offered to help them weave the fabric into two beautiful, distinct garments, transforming a moment of conflict into one of collaboration. The green thread, having no target, dissipated harmlessly. She went to the toolmaker and did not argue with him, but asked him to teach her his traditional methods, his pride in his mastery overriding the fear of the new. The gray thread loosened its grip. She was learning to be a weaver in her own right, not of the threads themselves, but of the mortals they sought to control. She was the liberator's agent, their hands in the mortal world acting with a precision and intimacy that the gods themselves could never achieve. But such a gift does not go unnoticed. Morwen, the weaver of lies, in his constant observation of the tapestry, noticed the strange new anomalies. He saw his threads of envy dissipating without cause. He saw threads of ambition being skillfully sidestepped. The patterns of fate in that one small valley were becoming unnaturally smooth, unnaturally perfect. It was as if someone was tidying up the threads. He knew no god would act with such subtlety. It had to be a mortal. His 1,000 whispering eyes turned their attention from the heavens to the earth. His search for the new, unknown player in the divine game had found a target. He did not yet know her name, but he now knew where to look. The mortal who could see the threads had just become the primary interest of the god who wove the lies.
Chapter 14. The Loom's Secret. Morwen, the weaver of lies, was a being of pure intellect, and he detested mysteries he could not solve. The anomaly in the small mountain valley was the most fascinating puzzle he had encountered in eons. His initial assumption was that a mortal had, through some freak accident of genetics or fate, developed a primitive sensitivity to the loom's workings. But the more he watched, the more he understood that this was no accident. The mortal's actions were too precise, too efficient. She did not just react to the threads. She anticipated them. She was not merely seeing the pattern, she was reading the sheet music before the notes were played. This was impossible for a mortal alone. She was being guided. This realization shifted the entire game. His true opponent was not this fragile human, but her unknown patron. Who was it? Not Solaris. The actions were too subtle, devoid of the sun god's blazing arrogance. Not Geb. The interventions were creative and adaptive, the opposite of the Titan's fearful rigidity. It was a third party, a hidden player, whose existence was a secret kept even from the gods themselves. This was the loom's true secret, a variable that had been missing from all his calculations, and Morwen resolved to uncover it. His methods were not of brute force. He would not send a plague or a monster. That would be clumsy. Instead, he would conduct an experiment. He would weave a special thread, a complex and beautiful lie, designed not to destroy the mortal, but to test the very limits of her perception. He would create a trap for her mind, and in observing how she navigated it, he would learn the nature of her guide. He set the stage. He took a sliver of the gray thread of sorrow and wove it into the fate of Lyra's tribe, creating a mild but persistent sickness that spread through the village. It was not lethal, but it caused weakness and despair, making the tribe vulnerable. He watched as Lyra did her best to counter it, her own connection to the silence providing moments of peace and resilience to the sick, but she could not cure the ailment itself. The tribe's morale began to fray. Then Morwen prepared his masterstroke. He did not use his thread of envy. He created something new. He captured a filament of pure, radiant hope from Solaris's corrupted thread, and a whisper of a thread of deception, a rare concept he had been cultivating himself. He wove them together, creating a beautiful, alluring golden thread that shone with the promise of a miracle. It was the thread of false hope. He gently introduced this thread into the loom, directing it towards Lyra's valley. Down on Aethel, the effect was immediate. Two of the tribe's hunters, searching for medicinal herbs, stumbled into a hidden grotto. There, bathed in a soft otherworldly light, grew a patch of luminous silver moss. The moment one of the sick villagers chewed a small piece, their fever broke, their strength returned. It was a miracle. The hunters returned, bearing the miraculous moss, and a wave of joyous relief swept through the tribe. They had found a cure. Their suffering was over. But Lyra had felt a profound sense of dread. When she looked upon the scene, she saw the threads. She saw the gray threads of sickness that had plagued her people. And she saw the new, beautiful golden thread that had led the hunters to the grotto. It shone with a brilliant, hopeful light, and it pulsed with the promise of salvation. But because her sight was a gift not of the loom but of the silence, she could see deeper. She saw what no one else could,
a thin, black, venomous-looking core running through the heart of the golden thread. She could see that this was not a thread of healing, but a thread of dependency. The moss would cure the symptoms, yes, but its hidden nature would slowly drain the life force of those who ate it, making them permanently reliant on it for survival, turning them into hollow shells. It was a beautiful, smiling poison. This was her greatest test. Her people were celebrating. They saw her as their guide, the one who had brought them through the winter. Now she had to stand before them and tell them that this miracle was a lie. She had to tell them to reject their salvation. She stood before the chief, the silver moss in his hand, ready to distribute it. "Do not eat it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "There is a shadow in this gift." The reaction was not what she had hoped. They did not listen. They saw only her standing in the way of their relief. The chief, his mind still subtly influenced by Solaris's thread of ambition, saw her as a challenger to his authority. "She is a child who speaks to shadows," he declared. "We have a real cure, given to us by the light." Her people, desperate and sick, turned against her, their hope twisting into suspicion and anger. On the psychic plane, Morwen watched with rapt attention. The mortal had seen it. She had seen the black core of his lie. His experiment was a success. He felt her desperate, silent struggle against the will of her own people. And then he felt something else. As the tribe's anger mounted, and as Lyra stood alone, a familiar sensation enveloped the scene. It was a bubble of perfect, peaceful nothingness. It did not stop the people's anger, but it shielded Lyra's mind from their psychic assault, giving her a moment of absolute clarity in the storm. Morwen focused all of his immense perception on this phenomenon, the void, the silence. It was the same anomaly that had saved the tribe in the first place. And he finally understood. He could not perceive the being itself because it had no psychic presence to perceive. It was a God-shaped hole in the universe, a power based not on existence, but on its absence. Oblivion, Morwen whispered to himself, the name of the forgotten thread sparking in his mind. A god born of oblivion, the ultimate anomaly. The loom's secret was revealed. His true enemy was not an architect or a custodian. It was this null god, this master of the void, who could negate fate and who had chosen a mortal with the impossible ability to see the threads as its eyes and hands in the world. Lyra, bolstered by the moment of silence, found her strength. She did not argue. She walked to the grotto, took a piece of the silver moss, and held it up for all to see. Then, using her own will, she connected her mind to the silent echoes, not with a prayer, but with a request. "Show them." The silent echo responded. He negated the thread of false hope, not in the loom, but at its very endpoint, the moss in Lyra's hand. For a moment, the moss remained a beautiful silver beacon. Then its inner light sputtered and died. The vibrant plant withered into black, rotten dust in her palm. The lie was exposed for all to see. The tribe stared in stunned, horrified silence. Morwen felt the negation as a psychic slap. His thread had been unwoven at its destination. The silent echo had not just dodged the trap, it had dismantled it and sent him a message. The game had changed. The pieces were finally on the board. Morwen now knew his enemy's nature and its agent. He would no longer be setting traps to test her. From now on, every thread he wove would be designed for one purpose: to corrupt, control, or destroy the mortal who could see the threads. Chapter 15. The Forging of a New Fate.
The horrified silence in the valley was broken by the tribe's chief, who dropped the withered dust of the false moss and fell to his knees before Lyra. "You saw the truth," he whispered, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a profound, soul-shaking awe. "We were blind." One by one, the other members of the tribe melt. They were no longer just her people, they were her followers. They had witnessed a battle of concepts they could not understand, a war fought with truth and lies, and they had seen their quiet priestess emerge as the victor. Their trust in her was now absolute. But Lyra felt no triumph. As she looked at their trusting faces, she felt only the crushing weight of her new reality. She had saved them from a lie, but she knew this was only the beginning. The being who had woven that lie was now aware of her. They were a small, peaceful tribe, and they had just made an enemy of a god. Her fears were quickly realized. On the psychic plane, Morwen adjusted his strategy. His direct test had failed, but it had yielded invaluable data. He now knew his true enemy was the power of negation, the silent void. To attack Lyra directly with a single corrupting thread was pointless. His patron would simply negate it. Therefore, he would not use a spear, he would use a net. He began to attack the world around her. He wove subtle threads of paranoia and fear into the minds of the neighboring tribes, whispering that Lyra's people were consorting with dark spirits, that their miraculous survival of the winter was a sign of a demonic pact. Trade routes that had been open for generations were suddenly cut off. Hunting parties that strayed too close to the valley's borders were met with suspicion and hostility. He was isolating them, turning their small sanctuary into a prison. Simultaneously, he manipulated the fates of the natural world. A thread of decay was woven into the great river that supplied their valley, causing the fish to sicken. A thread of confusion was sent into the hearts of the migratory beasts, leading them away from the mountains. He was not attacking Lyra's tribe with a single dramatic catastrophe, but with 1,000 small, invisible cuts, a death by slow attrition. The liberators watched this new strategy unfold with growing alarm. Kairos's thoughts were sharp with frustration. "We are playing his game," she projected to her allies. "We are reactive. He weaves a lie, we negate it. He weaves a curse, we create an exception. We are plugging holes in a dam that is cracking in 1,000 places. We cannot win by simply erasing his moves. We must change the board itself." It was the silent echo who proposed the new strategy. He had returned from the void not just with the power to negate, but with an understanding of its true nature. The void was not simply an absence, it was the ultimate potential. It was the state of being before the loom had woven its first thread. It was pure, untamed freedom. He projected his plan to the others. It was audacious, radical, and terrifyingly dangerous. He would not just negate a single thread, he would use his power to create a sanctuary of fate, a bubble of reality around Lyra's valley where the influence of the Great Loom, and therefore of Morwen, could not enter. He would unweave an entire section of the tapestry. Morpheus, the dreamweaver, was stunned. To sever a part of the world from its own destiny, the psychic backlash could destroy the mortals. Their minds are not meant for such untethered existence. "They will not be untethered," Kairos chimed in, grasping the silent echo's plan with dawning excitement. "The loom provides their fate now, but within the sanctuary, they will provide their own. Their choices, their will, their beliefs, they will become the new threads. We will not be cutting them off. We will be giving them the loom."
It was an act of divine abdication, a transfer of power from the gods to mortals, even if only on a small scale. It was the ultimate expression of their faction's philosophy. They agreed. They needed Lyra as their anchor. Morpheus once again opened a path into her dreams, but this time he was not alone. Kairos and the other liberators joined him, appearing to Lyra's sleeping consciousness not as gods, but as feelings, a sense of infinite choice, of boundless creativity, of quiet strength. Kairos explained the plan. They could shield her valley, but the people within would be responsible for their own destiny. Their fate would no longer be written in the stars, but forged by their own hands. It was a gift, but also a terrible burden. Did they accept? Lyra, speaking for her people, gave her assent. The ritual began. On the psychic plane, the liberators gathered their will. Morpheus wove a protective layer of dreams around the valley, to shield the mortal minds from the shock. Kairos held open the infinite pathways of choice, preparing to catch the unwritten fates of the people. And at the center, the silent echo took a deep, conceptual breath and pushed. He pushed back against the entire tapestry of fate. He projected his domain of nothingness not at a single thread, but at the very fabric of reality that defined the valley. The resistance was immense. He felt the weight of every thread, every law, every predetermined event that the loom had ever woven for that small patch of land. He felt the arrogant ambition of Solaris and the fearful stagnation of Jeb pushing back against him. But he also felt the power of the void, the infinite potential of non-existence. He was not destroying fate, he was creating an exception to it. A shimmering, invisible dome of pure silence began to form around the valley. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed, but to a being who could see the threads, the effect was breathtaking. Every thread of fate, gold, silver, green, and red, that touched the border of this dome simply stopped. They did not break, they just ended, their influence nullified at the sanctuary's edge. Inside the valley, Lyra and her people felt it as a physical sensation, a constant, low-grade pressure they had never even known was there suddenly lifted. The air seemed clearer, their thoughts sharper. A sense of profound clarity and agency settled over them. They were afraid, but it was a clean fear, their own. They were hopeful, and it was a fragile hope, born of their own will. For the first time, they were truly, utterly themselves. Morwen felt it instantly. The dozens of subtle threads he had been weaving around the valley suddenly went slack. His connection was severed. When he tried to peer into the valley with his divine senses, he found only a blank spot, a perfect void. The valley had become a hole in his map of the world. He could see its borders, but he could not see inside. He had been locked out. He was not angry. He was fascinated. His true enemy, the null god, was far more powerful and creative than he had imagined. It had not just erased a move, it had taken a piece of the board and declared it a new sovereign nation with its own rules. But this act of ultimate defiance did not go unnoticed by the others. The sudden severing of so many threads sent a violent tremor through the entire structure of the Great Loom. In his palace of light, Solaris felt the sudden loss of his connection to the valley as a personal insult, a challenge to his power. In his deep cavern, Jeb felt the sudden hole in the tapestry as a terrifying wound, a sign of the prophesied unraveling. The quiet, secret war of whispers was over. The liberators had made their move, and now all the gods were looking at the silent, shimmering dome around a small mountain valley, a place that was now the freest and most dangerous location in the universe.
Chapter 16: The War of Whispers and Lies. The creation of the sanctuary sent a shockwave of silence across the divine realm. For the first time, all three factions were aware of each other, and the secret war of influence erupted into a cold war of ideology, fought not with direct power, but with whispers and lies. Solaris was consumed by a righteous fury. The valley, now a blind spot to his divine sight, was an intolerable act of rebellion. It was a patch of darkness in his otherwise sunlit world, an affront to his self-proclaimed authority. He could no longer directly attack the tribe with his threads of ambition, so he turned his attention to the rest of the mortal world. He began a grand campaign of propaganda. He wove visions and divine pronouncements into the dreams of kings and high priests across Ethel. He spoke of a cult of the void, a shadowy group hidden in the Dragon's Tooth Mountains that sought to unravel reality. He painted Lyra's tribe as heretics, who consorted with nothingness, whose unnatural freedom was a plague that threatened to spread across the world. He presented himself as the sole protector of the Maker's design, the champion of light prophesied to save the world from this silent doom. Mortal kingdoms, swayed by his divine charisma and their own fear of the unknown, began to mobilize. Armies, for the first time in history, began to march towards the mountains, not for conquest, but on a holy crusade against an enemy they did not understand. Jeb and the custodians reacted with a deep, existential terror. The hole in the tapestry was the physical manifestation of the shattered prophecy's warning, the coming of the King of Nothing. They saw the sanctuary not as an act of defiance, but as a symptom of a terminal illness. They believed the fabric of reality was failing, and their response was to try and freeze it in place. They pulled on their threads with all their might, not to influence, but to petrify. Their influence spread across Ethel like a metaphysical winter. The pace of evolution slowed to a crawl. The chaotic, life-giving processes of mutation and adaptation were stifled. The world became more stable, but it was the stability of a corpse. Rivers flowed in perfectly straight lines, seasons arrived on the exact same day each year, and the vibrant and unpredictable pulse of life began to fade into a slow, monotonous rhythm. They were preserving a world by suffocating it. Into this growing storm of fanaticism and fear stepped Morwen, the weaver of lies. This was a battlefield perfectly suited for his talents. With the two major factions locked in a struggle of extremes, he was free to play them against each other, his whispers turning suspicion into certainty and disagreement into hatred. To Solaris, he appeared as a loyal strategist. "Your cause is just," his thoughts would chime, "but the custodians are weak. Their fear makes them passive. They claim to revere the loom, but they do nothing to defend it from this void cult. Can you truly trust those who would rather watch the temple burn than help you quench the flames? Perhaps their passivity is a lie, a cover for their own secret manipulations." To Jeb, he appeared as a concerned confidant. "The hole in the tapestry is a horror," he would whisper, his thoughts laced with feigned sympathy. "But have you considered its nature? To sever fate requires an act of immense aggressive will. It is not a passive act of decay. It feels like the work of an architect, does it not? Solaris speaks of chaos, yet it is his ambition that has stretched the threads to their breaking point. What if he created this crisis himself to justify his own ascension to supreme power?" He planted seeds of doubt in both camps, ensuring they would never unite. He fueled the architect's arrogance and the custodian's paranoia.
keeping them distracted and focused on each other. This left him free to pursue his own, true interest, studying the sanctuary, the impossible bubble of reality where the Great Loom held no sway. He was the only one who understood that this was not just a war for control of the old system, it was the birth of a new one. And inside that new system, life was hard. The people of Lyra's tribe, now the freemen of the valley, learned the true weight of their gift. With no threads of fate to guide them, every day was a struggle of pure will and intellect. The harvest was not guaranteed. They had to learn the complex language of the soil and the sky, becoming the world's first true scientists. Sickness was not a curse to be endured, it was a puzzle to be solved, leading them to discover the medicinal properties of plants through trial and error. Lyra was their guide. Her ability to see the threads had transformed. With the loom's influence gone from the valley, there were no threads to see. Instead, she now saw the potential within things. She could look at a seed and see not just the plant it was, but the countless plants it could become. She could look at a person and see the branching paths of their own choices laid out before them. She was no longer a seer of fate, but an oracle of possibility. She taught her people not what to do, but how to choose. They were forging their own destiny, one difficult, exhausting, and glorious day at a time. This freedom was maintained at a great cost. The liberators, the small band of forgotten gods, spent their immense power not on influencing the world, but on simply holding the sanctuary's border. The silent echo was the anchor, his domain of nothingness pushing back against the constant crushing pressure of the entire tapestry of fate. The effort was immense, a constant strain that left him and his allies with little energy for anything else. They were the silent, unseen guardians of the world's first free will. The world was now poised on a knife's edge. Outside the sanctuary, mortal armies, fueled by divine lies, marched towards the mountains. The world was slowly crystallizing under the influence of the fearful custodians. The gods were on the verge of open war, each convinced of their own righteousness, and inside a small, isolated valley, a tribe of mortals was learning the profound and difficult art of being truly alive, unaware that the entire world was gathering at their borders to extinguish their impossible light.
Chapter 17. The Siege of the Sun Temple. The divine Cold War could not last. A system under such immense opposing pressures was destined to shatter. Morwen, the weaver of lies, understood this better than anyone. He had spent eons setting the pieces on the board, and now it was time to orchestrate the checkmate. He required a single dramatic event that would turn the gods' paranoia into open warfare, an act so egregious that it could not be ignored. His target was the heart of the architect faction, Solaris's Sun Temple. The temple was the ultimate symbol of Solaris's pride, a fortress of solidified light where he held his counsel. It was considered inviolable, a testament to a supreme power. An attack on the temple was not just an act of war, it was an act of blasphemy. Morwen began to weave his masterpiece. He gathered not a simple thread, but a complex tapestry of deception. He took a filament of Geb's heavy, fearful stillness, a sliver of the silent echo's void-like energy to make it untraceable, and wove them together with his own perfected thread of deception. He crafted a phantom, an illusionary attacker that radiated the pure, conceptual energy of stagnation and decay. It was a perfect caricature of the custodian's deepest nature, an entity that screamed of their fearful, rigid philosophy. He then unleashed this phantom, not as a direct assault, but as a stealthy infiltration.
The phantom did not try to break the temple's walls of light. Instead, it seeped into the temple's foundations, its stagnant energy causing the pure, eternal light to momentarily flicker and dim. It was a subtle violation, like a single drop of poison in a well. It caused no real damage, but its symbolic impact was absolute. It was a stain of decay on a monument to perfection. Solaris felt the intrusion as a physical violation. He was in his throne room, basking in his own glory, when a cold, dead sensation slithered through his sanctum. The brilliant light of his temple faltered for a single horrifying moment, replaced by a feeling of utter, stagnant stillness. He saw the phantom, a formless beast of stone and shadow, and in its essence he felt the undeniable signature of the custodians. Morwen's whispers, which had poisoned his mind for so long, now crystallized into absolute certainty. This was the betrayal he had been warned about. The custodians, the cowardly guardians of stasis, had finally shown their true intent. This was not just an attack, it was a declaration that his light, his ambition, and his vision for the universe were to be extinguished and replaced by a cold, gray, unchanging eternity. His rage was incandescent. He did not pause to question, to investigate. To do so would be to admit a sliver of doubt, and his pride allowed none. He rose from his throne, his form swelling with the fire of 1,000,000,000 stars, his voice no longer a majestic chorus, but a single focused roar of pure fury tore across the psychic plane. "The time for words is over," he bellowed, his thought reaching every god. "The forces of stagnation have laid siege to the very heart of light. The custodians have declared war on creation itself. As the champion of the Maker's design, I will answer. There will be no more compromise. There will be only order. My order." Geb and the custodians felt this declaration like a mountain cracking in half. They were innocent. They had felt the strange flicker at the Sun Temple, but had dismissed it as another of Solaris's arrogant power displays. Now they were being accused of a crime they not only did not commit, but could not even comprehend. The accusation was so absolute, so filled with baseless conviction, that they finally understood the truth. This was not about a misunderstanding. This was a purge. Solaris had finally found his pretext to eliminate all opposition and seize total, undisputed control of the Great Loom. Their fear, which had so long been a passive, defensive force, now hardened into a grim, defiant resolve. If the sun god brings the fire of tyranny, Geb's slow, heavy thoughts resonated to his followers, then the earth will rise to meet it. We will not bend. We will not break. We will endure. And so the first open war of the gods began. It was a battle not of bodies, but of pure concept. Solaris gathered the full might of the architects and unleashed a wave of pure, concentrated ambition. It was a searing golden light of pure energy, a command for all things to change, to grow, to strive, to conquer, to become more. On Aethel, this conceptual wave manifested as a physical cataclysm. Deserts flash-formed from grasslands, rivers boiled in their beds, and the sun's light burned with a terrifying, cancerous intensity. The custodians met this wave with their own. They projected a wall of absolute unyielding stasis. It was a wave of pure inertia, a command for all things to stop, to be still, to remain as they were, to resist all change. On the mortal world, its effect was just as devastating. The wave of searing light met the wall of absolute cold. Where they clashed, forests were instantly petrified, their leaves turning to stone in mid-flutter. Half an ocean flash-froze into a jagged, unnatural glacier. The very air crystallized into glittering, deadly dust. The world of Aethel was being torn apart.
Mortals caught between these warring concepts were annihilated. Entire civilizations, which had been painstakingly woven into the tapestry over millennia, were erased in a single moment of divine rage. The liberators watched in horror. The effort of maintaining their sanctuary was now 1,000 times more difficult against the violent thrashing of the loom. From within the valley, Lyra, through her connection, could feel the psychic screams of a dying world. She felt the terror of millions of souls being unwritten from existence. The small peace she had found for her people now seemed like a tiny, fragile raft in a world-drowning tsunami. And Morwen, the weaver of lies, observed the beautiful, elegant destruction he had wrought. He had done it. He had turned the two most powerful forces in the universe against each other. They would exhaust themselves, break themselves, on the anvils of their own ideologies. The world would burn, yes, but to him it was a necessary fire. A fire that would clear the way for a new world, a world free from the tyranny of both ambition and stagnation, a world where he would be free to weave whatever truth he desired. With the guardians of the old order now locked in mutual destruction, the path was finally clear for him to turn his full, undivided attention to the only real threat left, the anomaly in the valley, and the silent god who protected it. The divine war raged, and Ethel screamed. The very fabric of reality was being torn apart by the absolute opposing wills of the architects and the custodians. The Great Loom, the machine that was meant to weave a coherent story, was now thrashing like a dying beast. Its threads, stretched, taut, and corrupted, were snapping one by one. The concepts they represented were bleeding into each other, creating monstrous paradoxes. In the mortal realm, this manifested as impossibilities, rivers of solid light, mountains that wept tears of pure sorrow, forests where the trees grew backwards in time. The end of the universe was no longer a distant threat, it was a present, unfolding catastrophe. Inside the sanctuary, the liberators felt the strain. The psychic pressure on their silent dome had become a relentless, hammering force. The silent echo, the anchor of their reality, was being worn down, his domain of nothingness barely holding against the combined chaotic energies of the warring factions. He knew they had reached a tipping point. Maintaining their small pocket of freedom was no longer enough. To save the universe, they had to stop the weavers. They had to stop the loom itself. This was a concept so radical that it had never been considered. The loom was a fundamental law of the universe, as absolute as gravity or time. To stop it was like trying to stop the concept of mathematics. But the silent echo, in his journey to the void, had learned a truth that had been forgotten since the time of the makers. The loom was not a law. It was a machine, and any machine could be turned off. He projected this idea to his allies. It was Kairos, the goddess of choice, who understood the implication. The heart of the machine, her thoughts chimed, a single clear note in the growing storm. The central gear, the place where the shuttle receives its commands. If we can reach it, we can interrupt the sequence. We can force a shutdown. The heart of the loom was not a physical place, it was a conceptual one, the central processing core where all the threads converged before being woven. It was the most heavily guarded, most stable point in all of creation. To reach it, they would have to travel through the very heart of the divine war, navigating a battlefield of pure, weaponized ideology. Their only way in was Lyra. She was their anchor in the physical world, and her unique sight was their only map. The liberators gathered their remaining power to perform their most dangerous act yet. They would not just shield her mind, they would project her consciousness, along with the silent echoes, into the very workings of the Great Loom.
In her meditation, Lyra felt their call. She accepted without hesitation. Her physical body fell into a deep, death-like trance, while her consciousness, guided by Morpheus and shielded by the silent echo's void, was flung into the psychic realm. The journey was a nightmare. She and the silent echo traveled through landscapes of pure, warring concepts. They flew through a storm of searing, golden ambition that screamed at them to conquer and consume. They navigated a frozen labyrinth of gray stagnation that tried to trap them in an eternal, unchanging moment. She saw the threads of fate not as a beautiful tapestry, but as the flailing, snapping power cables of an overloaded machine. She saw the gods themselves, no longer as distinct beings, but as monstrous, formless vortexes of pure, obsessive ideology locked in a mindless, suicidal embrace. Guided by the silent echo's perfect silence, which made them almost invisible, they navigated the chaos and reached the center. The heart of the loom was a place of impossible, serene beauty. It was a sphere of pure white light, calm and silent, the eye of the hurricane. Here all the corrupted, warring threads converged, their chaotic energies momentarily neutralized and ordered before being sent to the shuttle. They could see the central mechanism, a crystalline gear that pulsed with the rhythm of causality. This was the source of the command, "Weave." But it was not unguarded. Standing before the central gear, observing the flow of fate with a cold, dispassionate interest, was Merwin. The weaver of lies turned, his form a perfect mirror of the calm white light around him. He had been waiting for them. The null god, his thoughts chimed, devoid of surprise. And its mortal pet. I must confess, I am impressed. To reach this place, it is a feat I myself have only recently achieved. The silent echo did not try to communicate. He knew words were useless. He gathered his power, the cold potential of the void, preparing to negate the central gear itself. But Merwin simply raised his hand. "Before you attempt your little trick, consider this," he projected. He gestured behind him, and the pure white light of the loom's heart shifted. For a moment, Lyra saw a vision. She saw her people, the freemen of the valley. They were not being ruled by fate, but they were still mortal. They were still subject to the fundamental laws of the universe, the laws that the loom upheld. They were still subject to the fundamental laws of the universe that the loom upheld. She saw one of them fall from a cliff, and the law of gravity, a concept maintained by the loom, took his life. She saw another grow old and die, the law of time, regulated by the loom's great gears, claiming her. "You see," Merwin explained, his tone that of a patient teacher, "this machine does not just weave stories, it maintains existence. It is the operating system of your reality. If you shut it down, you do not just stop the war. You stop time. You stop causality. You stop life and death. Your precious mortals in their little bubble of freedom will not be free. They will be frozen in a single meaningless moment for all eternity. An existence far worse than any fate I could devise." It was a perfect trap, forged of pure logic. The silent echo faltered, his will wavering for the first time. There was no correct move. Any action he took would lead to annihilation. But it was then that Lyra, the mortal, spoke. Her thought, projected through the silent echo's shield, was small but unshakable. She said, "You are wrong," to Merwin. The makers were not gods. They were artists. This machine isn't just an operating system. It's an instrument. And the problem is not the instrument. It's the musicians. She turned her thought to the silent echo, a wave of pure, unwavering trust. You showed me that we could write our own story. You taught us to be free. Now let us teach them. The silent echo understood. Lyra had seen the truth that had eluded even the gods. They did not need to shut down the loom. They needed to change the song. They had to take control of the instrument. Their goal was not to stop the weaving, but to become the weavers.
Chapter 19. The Final Thread of Fate. Morwen's logic was a perfect crystalline prison. He stood before them in the heart of the loom, a warden confident in the strength of his bars. He had presented them with an impossible choice: a world torn apart by warring fates, or a world frozen in a single meaningless moment. Both were forms of annihilation. Both were a victory for his philosophy of chaos and decay. The silent echo felt the weight of this paradox, the pull of the void beckoning him towards the simple, clean answer of shutting it all down. But Lyra's thought, her simple mortal clarity, was an anchor. The problem is not the instrument, it's the musicians. She faced Morwen, her small mortal consciousness standing firm against the ancient cosmic intellect of the god. You speak of freedom, her thought projected, carried by the silent echo's power. But what freedom do you offer? You seek to replace the tyranny of the loom with your own, a world where the only truth is your lies. You are no different than Solaris. He wishes to be the sole author of the story. You wish to be the only one allowed to burn the pages. Both are forms of ultimate control. That is not freedom. That is just a different kind of cage. For the first time in his existence, Morwen was thrown off balance. His entire philosophy was built on his intellectual superiority, his belief that he was the only one who saw the true nature of their prison. This mortal, this insignificant speck of life, had just exposed the fundamental flaw in his own logic. She had seen that his desire for chaos was just another form of tyranny. His silence in that moment was more profound than any the silent echo could create. And in that moment of silence, the silent echo acted. He did not lunge for the central gear to destroy it. He lunged for it to claim it. He poured his consciousness, his power of the void, around the crystalline heart of the machine. He did not negate the gear. He negated the connections to it. He created a perfect, impenetrable shield of pure potential around the loom's command center, severing the psychic links that Solaris, Geb, and all the other gods had to it. The threads of ambition, stagnation, and fear that were feeding into the loom's heart suddenly went slack, their influence cut off at the source. He had created a null interface, a clean slate, a silent throne at the center of reality, and he and Lyra were the only ones before it. We cannot force peace upon them, Lyra's thought was clear and resolute. That would make us no better than they are, but we can change the rules of the instrument. They were no longer just observers or correctors. They had to become the weavers, not to tell a single story, but to create a new kind of tapestry altogether. This was the moment to weave the final thread, a thread that was not on any of the maker's spools. The silent echo reached into his own being, into the infinite potential of the void he had touched. He pulled forth not a thread of chaos, but a thread of pure, unwritten possibility. It was colorless, formless, and shimmered with the light of a billion choices yet to be made. Lyra reached into her own mortal soul, into her understanding of hope, of fear, of love, of sacrifice. She took the raw potential offered by the silent echo, and with her will gave it shape and purpose.
She imbued it with a single, simple, yet revolutionary concept. Together they presented this new thread to the central gear. The loom, now free from the warring wills of the other gods, accepted it without hesitation. The shuttle of cause and effect picked up the new shimmering thread and began to weave. It was the final thread of fate, and it did not tell a story. It wrote a new fundamental law into the very fabric of existence. The law was choice and consequence. The thread decreed that the power of a god's concept was no longer absolute. From this moment on, a god's influence upon the world would be directly proportional to the number of mortal souls who freely and consciously chose to align themselves with their principle. A god could no longer impose their will. They had to earn it. This new law propagated through the entire loom instantly, a silent, irreversible update to the operating system of the universe. On the divine battlefield, the effect was immediate and absolute. Solaris, in a final, furious push, unleashed a wave of pure, conquering ambition meant to shatter the custodians once and for all. But the wave, once a torrent of divine fire, was now a pathetic flicker. It touched the world and found no mortal minds, no free souls who were actively choosing tyranny and conquest in that moment. It had no fuel. It dissipated into nothing. Geb, in a desperate attempt to defend himself, projected a wall of absolute stagnation, but he found his power equally diminished. The fundamental nature of life is change and growth, and with few mortals actively choosing to be frozen in time, his thread had no anchor. His wall of ice became a thin, brittle sheet of glass and shattered. The gods for the first time felt powerless. Their war, which had threatened to tear the universe apart, ground to a halt not because of a superior force, but because the rules of power itself had been fundamentally rewritten. They were no longer puppet masters. They were now patrons, their influence depending entirely on the beliefs and choices of the very mortals they had once seen as insignificant. Morwen, watching from the heart of the loom, was horrified. This was not the beautiful chaos of dissolution he had envisioned. This was a new, more complex, and to him more disgusting form of order, an order based on the free will of insignificant creatures. He tried to weave a final grand lie, a thread of pure deception to counteract this new law, but the thread had no power. It needed a believer to give it strength, and no mortal soul freely chooses to believe in a lie for its own sake. He was a weaver with no thread, a voice with no one to listen to. His entire purpose was rendered obsolete. Without a system to corrupt or a fate to unravel, he simply faded, his form dissolving not into the chaos of the void, but into the ultimate irrelevance of a forgotten idea. At the center of the now quiet machine, Lyra and the silent echo stood before the central gear, which pulsed with a new, gentle, multi-hued light, reflecting the infinite choices of the mortal world. The war was over. The musicians had been silenced, and the instrument had been given a new song to play. The universe was saved, but it was now a universe they no longer recognized, a universe waiting to see what its inhabitants would choose to become.
Chapter 20. The Age of Chosen Fates. In the aftermath of the final thread's weaving, a great, profound silence fell across the divine realm. The war was over, not with a climactic explosion, but with the quiet turning of a key in a lock. The gods,
both architects and custodians, were still there, but their power, once absolute and unconditional, was now a mere reflection of the mortal world below. They felt the billions of new, tiny threads of mortal will now feeding into the loom, and for the first time they felt humbled. They were no longer the authors of the story. They were now merely characters within it, their influence granted to them by the very beings they had once sought to control. At the heart of the loom, their work was done. Lyra and the silent echo looked at the central gear, which no longer pulsed with a single authoritative light, but shimmered with a gentle, chaotic, and beautiful spectrum of every color imaginable, each hue representing a choice being made by a mortal soul. To maintain control of the loom now would be to violate the very law they had just created. The silent echo did not need Lyra's guidance to know what to do. He slowly withdrew his shield of nothingness from the central gear. The psychic connections to the other gods were restored, but the nature of those connections had changed. They were no longer inputs for command, but channels for prayer and belief. He had become the ultimate corrector. He had not just fixed a glitch. He had changed the fundamental operating system from a dictatorship to a democracy. Lyra's consciousness, her great task complete, was gently released. She floated back through the psychic realm, no longer seeing a battlefield of warring concepts, but a new harmonious ecosystem of ideas. She returned to her body in the quiet valley. When she opened her eyes, the world felt new. The air was crisp with a potential it did not have before. The constant low-grade pressure of a predetermined fate was gone. The world was quiet, waiting for instructions, not from the heavens, but from its own inhabitants. The silent echo retreated to his own domain, the space between things. But it was no longer a realm of isolation and torment. It was now the calm, balanced center of the universe. It was the silence that was necessary for the new, complex music of mortal choice to be heard clearly. He had found his true purpose, not as a participant, but as the perfect, impartial context for all existence. Centuries passed. The memory of the divine war faded into myth, into legend. The era that followed was known by the scholars of Aethel as the Age of Chosen Fates. Humanity, now unbound by a rigid destiny, flourished in ways never before imagined. Without the loom dictating their path, they were forced to invent their own. Great philosophies were born, grappling with the new, terrifying weight of absolute free will. Arts and sciences exploded as mortals were now free to imagine and create things that the loom, in its limited perfection, had never conceived. The gods adapted. They had to. Solaris, no longer able to fuel his power with his own ambition, learned to become a true inspiration. He was no longer a god of conquest, but a patron of explorers, of artists, of scientists who pushed the boundaries of knowledge. His power shone brightest not when he commanded it, but when a mortal looked to the horizon and chose to journey into the unknown. His power was granted to him by their hope. Jeb, the Earth Titan, found a new purpose, not in stagnation, but in community. He became the patron of builders, of farmers, of families. His strength was not in resisting change, but in providing a stable foundation upon which mortals could choose to build their lives. His power was granted to him by their choice to put down roots and care for one another. The liberators, the forgotten echoes, found their place at the heart of this new world. Kairos, the goddess of choice, became one of the most revered principles in the pantheon. Her shrines found at every physical and metaphorical crossroads. Morpheus, the master of dreams, no longer just reflected the day's events. He now guided a universe of truly creative, unbound dreamers, his power growing with every new idea born in the minds of sleeping mortals. Lyra lived a long and peaceful life. She never ruled as a queen or commanded as a general. She became known as the first oracle, but she did not prophesy the future. Instead, she taught people how to see the infinite possibilities within their own choices. She taught them to listen to the silence, to find the quiet space within themselves where their own true path could be found. Her legacy was not a religion, but a philosophy of freedom, a final gift to her people. And the silent echo? He never took a name. He never took a solid form. He never again intervened directly. He remained in his quiet domain, the eternal, silent guardian of the balance he had created. He was the God that did not act, but whose existence allowed all action to have meaning. He was the final, perfect freedom, the freedom for the universe to be itself. He was the silence that was the ultimate answer to the question, why? The old chronicle, the story of the makers and the war of their children, was complete. The new chronicle, the one being written every day by the countless unpredictable choices of mortals, had only just begun. Its pages were infinite, its ending forever unwritten. And in that, the universe had finally found its perfect, beautiful, and lasting peace.
And so, the chronicle of the Great Loom comes to a close, leaving behind a universe of infinite, unwritten pages. If this saga resonated with you, let us know by leaving a like. And to ensure you don't miss the next forgotten tale, be sure to subscribe to Chronicle and become a keeper of the lore. And if you enjoyed this story of a god born as a glitch, we invite you to explore our previous chronicle. It tells the tale of a mortal boy in a world governed by a digital system, who was born with a level of 0. Discover the story of the null who broke the system. It is a journey no less epic and engaging. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until the next story is told.